times we have to know how to reinvent ourselves and to adapt to the new reality. And I think these conferences that we do with the Autonomous University are a good example of what we can do. And I see this afternoon's conference and tonight's conference, we are lots of people interested. Despite of it's 9 o'clock, it's a little bit late, but we have a lot of people interested in the conference. This is the success of these initiatives. So what can I say? I wish you all a fruitful conference, which I believe is going to be with the quality of our conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel Marinheiro. Let me begin by welcoming and thanking our distinguished guest, Professor Robert Sutter, whom I will introduce in a moment. First, I'd like also to welcome my students and all the participants in this webinar, and thank you for your understanding to keep the videos and audios off to avoid overloading the system and to see and hear Professor Robert Sutter in the best conditions. Notice that this conference is being recorded and that the link to the recording will then be made available on the OBSERVARE and IDN websites. This conference is part of a vast cycle of webinars associated with advanced regional studies courses that the Autonomous University of Lisbon and OBSERVARE organize in partnership with National Defense Institute. Specifically, this conference by Professor Robert Sutter is the second webinar on China and Asia Pacific. Today afternoon, we had a conference by Professor Mark Beeson from Australia, and next week, May 13th, we'll have another webinar with participation of 7 Portuguese scholars, and other webinars will follow in May and June, and we will let you know in due course. But without waiting any longer, I'm now introducing Professor Robert Sutter, to whom I once again thank the honor of being available to share his many insights and perspectives. On behalf of all of us, I also thank Professor Sutter for making available the file with his talking points already in the possession of all those who attend this webinar. Robert Sutter is Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University since 2011. He also served as director of the school's main undergraduate program involving over 2,000 students from 2013 to 2019. His earlier full-time position was visiting professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University. A PhD graduate in History and East Asian Languages from Harvard University, Professor Sutter has published 22 books, 4 with multiple editions, over 300 articles, and several hundred government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and their relations with the United States. His most recent book is The United States and Asia, Regional Dynamics and 21st Century Relations, 2nd edition, published by Rowman and Littlefield, 2020. Professor Robert's government career since the 60s saw service as senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service, the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at US government's National Intelligence Council, the China Division Director at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Bob, once again, thank you. Please, the stage is yours.
Well, I'm very grateful to be part of your seminar today. It's a great honor for me to share with you some thoughts about the American approach to China. This is something that I hope you find rewarding. It's not a good story. It's a story that's moving toward greater tension. And so, but bear with me. It's something that we need to understand. And this is a story that I'm honored to do this because it's something that began here in Washington. This is something that often people that live inside the Beltway, as I do, think that we make foreign policy in the United States, and that often isn't the case. But in the case of this one, of this harder policy toward China, this is something that I think I'd like to explain it to you, at least give you my perspective on this question. I'm the type of person who's had a lot of government experience, and so I always have a handout. And so you have my handout, and so you know what I'm saying. It's written down, and I'll be following along the handout as I do my discussion. Just as an overview, what I intend to do is a couple of things. First, I want to explain the background. Where did this, what were the roots of this tension that we see in American policy toward China in recent years? Where did it come from? And so I want to explain that in some detail. And then I have three basic segments of how this hard policy toward China evolved. I'm going to first focus on the year 2018. That was the most important year. And I'll explain why, where things got very hard toward China. And then in 2019, there were cross currents. There was still a lot of hardness in American government policy, but there was a lot of ambivalence at the same time. And the country as a whole didn't necessarily support this kind of approach toward China. And so we had a lot of ambivalence in American attitudes toward China in 2019. This was the period when we were doing the trade negotiations with China, as you may recall. In 2020, some of us thought there might be a breakthrough with the virus. We thought that the virus is such an enormous international catastrophe could bring China and the United States to cooperate together to deal with this issue. And what we have found instead is that this has deeply intensified the gap between the United States and China. This has now gotten to the point where it impacts American public opinion in a major way. And we're leading into our elections and presidential elections later this year. And this is going to be a big issue in our elections. And so I wanted to explain the dynamics, the changing situation. So you can see that the trajectory is not good if you're interested in easing tensions. It's not good at all. It doesn't mean war, but it means moving towards some type of a Cold War, a disengagement to the point of acute rivalry. And this is where we are right now, as far as our government is, the government of the United States is concerned, and I think the government of China is concerned. And so I want to explain it. And I think the cause of this, the catalyst and the drivers, are the Americans. It's the American government that's done this. And it's a big change in American policy. As you can see, I've had a lot of government experience. I've had a lot of experience in Washington. I've been here for over 50 years. I understand a lot of things, how things work in the intelligence community, how they work in the Congress, how they work in the State Department. I've worked in these places. I know how they work. And I'm very interested in how this has all come together from that point of view, watching the different players and playing their role and making policy and what's important in policy. And so I saw the change under the Nixon administration. That change toward China was a remarkable change. It was done in secret. This is not being done in secret. This is being done very openly. And so that's my goal today. So put on, tighten your seatbelts a little bit as I try to go through these various points. The first section will look at the relevant background so that we understand why did this wonderful, seemingly wonderful relationship of engagement, why did it change so rapidly and seem so suddenly in the minds of many people? So the way I try to understand it is I go back to Nixon and Mao. This was back in the early 70s. Actually, it was in the late 60s when they were working together clandestinely. And so the upshot of this is that the United States and China were working together heavily against the Soviet Union. They both had a very strong concern about the Soviet Union. Often the United States looks like a superpower. This is the period when the US really wasn't much of a superpower in so many respects. It was badly beaten in Vietnam. They had major disruptions in this country, worse than what we're seeing in recent years, for sure. Martial law, you may remember this, it's in your history books. In the spring of 1968, martial law was declared in Washington, D.C. for 2 weeks. This was the weeks after Martin Luther King was assassinated. We had mass demonstrations in the city. Fire people went out to put out the fire. They were being shot at by these snipers, and they retreated, and the city burned. It burned for 2 weeks. And this is Washington. And so, yes, I've seen worse times in my lifetime in the United States, although now it's not a good time, for sure. But the upshot of this is the US needed help, and China was that help. And China needed it too. China was under direct nuclear threat from the Soviet Union, and they weren't ready at all. And so the upshot of this was that the two sides had in a way, a marriage of convenience. They needed each other in the worst kind of way. And this kind of antipathy to the Soviet Union held the Americans and the Chinese together, even though their systems and their interests were so different in so many ways. There really was nothing they agreed on to speak of. Just look at the Shanghai Communique that marked Nixon's visit to China. It shows what the US wanted, and it shows what the Chinese wanted, and they totally disagreed on just about everything. But they didn't agree on working against the Soviet Union. And that was what kept them together. So that was okay, and we did well in the relationship, keeping us together. Many differences, many difficulties, but for 20 years, it worked pretty well. Until Tiananmen. You may remember Tiananmen. This is a major development in China where the Chinese cracked down on their demonstrators in a brutal way. And concurrently, the Berlin Wall collapses and the Soviet Union soon is no more. So the whole rationale of the relationship from the American point of view just sort of disappears. And the main reason why the US was accommodating to China had to do with this Soviet danger. Well, the Soviet danger is over. And so under those circumstances, and China looking very offensive, the US basically tears up the understanding with China. And the Congress, the media just dump all over China, criticize it, just continuously harshly criticizing it. The US executive branch under President George H.W. Bush tries to preserve the relationship. They succeed to some degree. But the Chinese know now that the US is a real danger to them. The US is opposed to them very strongly on human rights and a whole range of other issues as well. So this makes it very difficult for the Chinese to really trust the United States in a meaningful way. And as a result of this kind of situation, we find that when we do start coming back together again, as we do, generally out of some necessity or another, the difficulty is getting over this lack of trust. So alternatively, we have tried to create frameworks to make our relationship work. Bill Clinton and the Chinese, President Clinton had an effort to build a strategic partnership with China. George W. Bush came into power in 2001. He said, I don't think we're going to have that, and he just stopped that. And then he and his administration wanted to work with China and have a framework, what he called responsible stakeholders. And the two would work together as responsible stakeholders. And the Chinese saw that as a trap to get them involved in spending a lot of money on international goods that they didn't want to spend money on. And so they avoided that. And then Mr. Obama comes into office, and at that time, people are talking about a G20. Prominent Henry Kissinger and other Americans are talking like this, that China and the United States could be a G2, not a G20, a G2, pardon me, just two governments running the world. And the Obama government thought that was a trap to undermine US-Japan relations, US-NATO relations, and so forth. And so they didn't do that. And finally, Xi Jinping, you may remember him. He is the leader of China today, very powerful, assertive leader, much more assertive than the previous ones, except for Mao Zedong. And Mr. Xi Jinping met with Mr. Obama in California in 2013, and he said, let's form a new type of great power relationship. And Obama never did that. So we could never have a lasting framework. We didn't have a lasting framework that worked with China. So we would zig and zag. We would have tensions, and then it would subside, and we have tensions, and they would subside. But the relationship was not firm, as it had been under the anti-Soviet agreement under Nixon and Mao. And so what this led to could have been bad, except during this period, and particularly in the period of the first decade of the 21st century, both countries had many differences with one another, but they kept them quiet. They didn't talk about them. They had dialogues where they discussed these things, but they didn't talk about them. And the differences were enormous, but they didn't discuss them. And what they did is emphasize the positive. And they kept the relationship on a positive level. And it was in the interest of both sides to do this. They both recognized that they could get benefits from positive engagement with one another. They both recognized that they had become so interdependent that if you were negative toward one party, you would hurt yourself. And both leaders, both Hu Jintao, the leader of China at that time, and Obama, the leader of the United States, and George W. Bush in his later years, both recognized they had so many other problems that they just didn't want a problem with one another. So that worked. It worked pretty well. And pragmatically, we got through the first decade pretty well, but then the second decade came along. And here's where change took place. And the Chinese will say that the change that defines this issue for them is Mr. Obama and his rebalance policy toward Asia. This began in 2011, where Mr. Obama said, well, look, I want to re-engage Asia. I want to emphasize our relationship with Asia, improve our relationship with all these countries and these international organizations in Asia. And he did it. And he did this sort of thing. And the Chinese didn't like it. They thought he was trying to contain them. And containment was not part of this, of course. And Mr. Obama's rationale was, no, I want to work with Asia. He did need Asian relations to make sure he could deal with China effectively. So there was that element to it for sure. But on the other hand, he knew that he had to engage China too, and he did very strongly. So the Chinese somewhat misread Obama, and I think they exaggerated lots of elements to it because all the other countries in Asia liked the rebalance policy, except North Korea didn't like it. All the others did. And so the result, so the Chinese say, well, that's when you started pushing. From the American perspective, they think that Chinese started pushing against them beginning with the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. That's when the Chinese calculated that the US was really pretty weak and that the whole economic model of the United States that they had been copying, they had been trying to do the things that America did, was flawed grossly. And because America was the responsible party in this crisis. And why did this disaster happen? American practices caused this sort of thing. And so the Chinese said, our system is better, we're better organized, and we are now better able to deal with these issues than you are because you're really wounded by this big economic crisis and recession. And so Chinese leaders became more assertive. They had differences with the United States and they started acting on them. And you saw this graphically eventually in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, Taiwan, Tibet, various issues with the United States, pressuring Mr. Obama in ways that he wasn't pressed before, and George Bush wasn't pressed. So from the American perspective, the hardening, the challenges that China raised escalated in this period, and they continued to do that. Now, Mr. Xi Jinping becomes the leader of China in 2012. Prior to that, these kinds of tendencies in China are held in check by Mr. Hu Jintao because he didn't really favor this kind of approach. He was one of these people still worried about preoccupations at home and wanted to get along with the United States. Mr. Xi Jinping is different. He wants to assert China's prominence. He has a China dream. And his China dream is a powerful China, the leading power of Asia, and a major power in the world. And who's in the way for that to take place smoothly? Well, the United States is in the way in lots of different ways. And so Mr. Xi Jinping finds ways to deal with this, to get what he wants for his government, an assertive role in the world. And he's been pushing ever since. And he's quite dramatic in doing it. So he does all sorts of things. These island building in the South China Sea is a graphic example of the type of things he did. But the trade disputes, IPR theft, buildup of the Chinese military focusing on American forces along the rim of Asia, human rights, Taiwan, is just a long list of challenges that he posed to the United States in this period that Mr. Obama tried to keep under wraps. He wanted to get along with Xi Jinping. He needed him he felt he needed him for climate change. He needed him for other issues to manage international affairs. And so he kept these under wraps. He didn't talk about them much, but in fact, they were festering. These were big, it was widely recognized that China was more challenging to the United States under the Xi Jinping regime beginning in 2012. This leads to a debate in the United States, not outwardly. Mr. Obama doesn't debate this outwardly. He does complain about Xi Jinping in his last 2 years. He does complain about him publicly, and Xi Jinping ignores it. He just ignores it. He doesn't respond. He just ignores his complaints. So Obama sort of has to just suck it up and continue to try to be accommodating to Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping's happy to do that. But at the same time, he's expanding in the South China Sea and doing all these other things that I was just talking about. And so critics of the Obama government say, you know, you're too predictable, you're too easy a mark for somebody like Xi Jinping. He's taking advantage of you. And yet Mr. Obama still needed China to cooperate on these broad global issues, and he chose not to make a big deal out of it. But it was an issue in the campaign of 2016, the presidential campaign. Many of the candidates talked negatively about China. The Republicans in the Congress had been negative about China before that. The Republican Party's platform of 2016 was very negative about China. So there were these elements, but it wasn't a big issue in the campaign. It's people say, "Oh, look at Mr. Trump, what he said about China in the campaign." He talked about things like, he says they're raping us economically, they're stealing things. The trade issues were big issues for Mr. Trump. He didn't think in China in terms of national security or strategy like that. Didn't talk about that. Didn't talk about Taiwan. It's trade, but you know, he didn't blame the Chinese. He said this explicitly. He says, I don't blame them for taking advantage of us. They're smart. He says the people at fault are the Americans who signed these trade deals. They're the ones that are at fault. So even Mr. Trump, with all his rhetoric, really wasn't hostile to China. He was hostile to these trade agreements that he was against. And so the campaign was overshadowed by many other issues, and China was really not that important. And so when he took power, I'm moving now into the Trump administration's 2017 and 2018, and here's when you start to see the beginnings of the change that I want to talk about. And again, it starts within Washington, and I'll explain that in a minute. First, in 2017, for the most part, the Trump administration was not hard on China. It was focused on North Korea in Asia. And then China was getting pressure to do more to contain North Korea's nuclear weapons development and missile tests. Those were the big issues at that time. But again, China's relationship was pretty good at this time. He met with the Xi Jinping several times. He had a wonderful trip to Asia in November of that year. And Xi Jinping laid out the red carpet for him in the Forbidden City. They had a big dinner, and it was just a great affair. And can you imagine this? You know, Mr. Trump, when he goes to all these places and so forth, he's not the most grateful guy. But he was very grateful to Xi Jinping in the extraordinary things he did to give him a very good visit in November of 2017. So it's against that background that we have a surprise. And the surprise is the National Security Strategy of the United States. This comes out in December of 2017. And most people don't pay attention to it. Now, I'm an old government bureaucrat. When government documents come out that are important on important issues, I read them. You know, and I'm a nerdy guy. I want to find out what the government is doing in this kind of thing. And I read this document, and it was so hard on China. I had not seen anything like this since the Johnson administration. Lyndon Johnson. That's when I started working in Washington. Lyndon Johnson. That's a long time ago, 50 years. The executive branch didn't treat China this way. Congress did, but not the executive branch. And here's this document. Just read it. It's not that long. China is the main danger facing the United States in the world, period. Russia's second. Iran is third with North Korea in there. China. And the document says, you know something? What's really important in security is economics. Economics is what's important. I mean, the military dimension is important, but economics is the ultimate force that's important. And this is the beginning, and this is the root of a key dynamic that I'd urge you to keep in mind, that when you look for people in Washington who are very energized about the China issue, sometimes, often, it comes down to this, and it's in the National Security Strategy, and it's also in the National Defense Strategy. We don't have the unclassified version of that, we just have reports on it. National Security Strategy, you can read it yourself, look it up. It's not big, not long. And in that, they say the economics are very important. And what it shows is that China is a threat to the United States economically. It's a threat because it's a threat to control high technology industries. These high technologies industries are the sinews that make up American future economic prosperity and power. Without these economic tools, the United States will be secondary. And they show that the military depends on these tools. And without these tools, the military will be secondary too. What does that mean to an American reading this and an American investigating this more closely? It means that China, if it takes over controls of the high technology industries of the future, which it's determined to do, it will dominate these fields, and it will dominate the military field, which will mean the United States will be dominated by China. That logic is something that I'd urge you to keep in mind. Not everybody has it. Many people aren't that sophisticated in how they look at China. They look at China because of human rights and other issues. That's a core concern. And if you're, there are many people that speak on this. The best one I've seen is my senator. His name is Mark Warner. He's a very moderate centrist Democrat. He was the governor of Virginia, very sensible guy. He's a graduate of the George Washington University. He made his fortune in high-tech industries. He knows high-tech. And he has been for 5 years the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He knows a lot about China. He said, after listening to all these briefings over the last 5 years, I have changed my position on China. He was very engaged with China when he was the governor, very supportive of close economic interaction with China. And he says, this is a Sputnik moment. Some of you may remember Sputnik and the effect it had on American and other Western attitudes toward the Soviet Union. And he says, if we don't meet this challenge, we're going to be secondary to China. So this is something that I want to share with you because I don't think people write this down too often. I don't think people report it too much. I think it's very important in understanding the urgency that comes with this. And this is a new issue. This has not been an issue before. We've had lots of trade disputes and all these other things with China, but not the issue of economic dominance through dominating high technology industry. And the second dimension that comes with this, another new issue that emerges at this time, is that why did Americans neglect China's rise this way? Why didn't we think about this before? And the argument here is that somehow we have been influenced by the Chinese not to do that. The Chinese have penetrated the United States in various ways through media control and wining and dining senior leaders and building and giving money to think tanks and this kind of thing. So now that is under acute investigation. Of course, it's also IPR theft is involved in this in a big way. But the bottom line here is that these two new issues added a great sense of urgency in the Congress on this issue. And what you find is that in 2018, the forces of this kind of urgency will come together and create a force that continues to drive this need for a tougher policy toward China. Okay, so I'm going to now move into 2018. And what happens is most people aren't paying much attention to the strategy. It didn't get a lot of attention. Most people are looking at this president we have. He does all these crazy seeming things. He's very erratic. And so the media reports all his antics. And he's full of antics. And so they don't look at the substance of what he's doing. And he's often not doing the substance. And so it complicates the situation. The point is here that what you find is that there are many people in the executive branch at the senior levels that are warning of China. The US trade representative, very articulate guy, and he says, China is an existential threat to the American economy. He says that in March of 2018. And this guy doesn't use words loosely. He's a very careful speaker. And the FBI director is constantly talking about China as an enormous challenge to penetrate the American society and the American government. So these two new threats and people like that mesh with people in the Congress like my Senator Warner, but so many others. And they come together and they become a collaborative force that pushes through a tough policy toward China, what they call a whole of government effort against China. Now, in most of 2018 is taken up with ambivalence on economic issues. Will Mr. Trump use punitive tariffs? Will he not use punitive tariffs? His people in the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, STR, they don't seem to agree with one another. They're arguing all the time. That's the main news story that's taking place. But the Congress gets together with the senior people in the administration and they come out with a foreign policy law that has various provisions in it that passes in 2018, August of 2018. And this defines US policy as a whole of government effort against the challenges that China faces. So as a bureaucrat, you say, well, you're in a department, what challenges are we faced in our department? You're supposed to find them out and focus on them and deal with them in one way or another. That's the law. And so it's quite a powerful law. And so so Congress sets this up and with the support of many people in the administration, and concurrently, Mr. Trump then starts implementing his punitive tariffs. He's come on a different track, but they do come. And so we get into the trade war, but at the same time, we have this underlying effort of a whole of government pushback against China. And various departments, particularly the Justice Department with the FBI, are very active in doing this sort of thing. But the Commerce Department gets in the act. And of course, DOD, the Defense Department, is very much, they're doing this all the time. They do it more quietly, but they're doing it all the time. And so there are a whole series of initiatives that make it clear that the United States is opposed to China in a whole range of ways. So this is when you get on the economic side, you have the punitive tariffs, you have the investment restrictions on China, and you have export controls. And then you work hard on domestic espionage and domestic influence operations and other domestic thefts leading to threats, leading to thefts of property and this type of thing. And then outwardly, you have strong attacks against the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea. This is when Huawei becomes a focal point of American antagonism, and the pressures that China is putting on Taiwan, even in the Pacific Island countries. And of course, the egregious Chinese behavior on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and on the Hong Kong issue are targets, of course, of strong antagonism from the United States. Concurrently, this government actively improves its relations with Taiwan, contrary to what the Obama government did and many earlier governments. Very different approach in dealing with this. So that's 2018. That continues until they have a truce. Xi Jinping and Trump agreed in late 2018 at the G20 meeting in Argentina that they're going to have a truce and they're going to have trade negotiations. And so that calms down the outward manifestations in the executive branch. You don't want to upset the boss when he's negotiating with the Chinese. So you don't see too much of the pressure from the executive branch agencies, even though they're doing a lot of things that are contrary to what China wants. But they're less vocal than they were in 2018. And they remain that way until the trade deal phase one, after, there were many fits and starts in these trade negotiations. I'm sure you're aware of that. They finally reach a phase one agreement in January of 2020. It takes them over a year. So in that year, you have ambivalent tendencies. Mr. Trump goes back and forth. He has a good phone call with Mr. Xi Jinping, and then he does more punitive tariffs. I mean, it goes back and forth throughout the year. The Congress remains more critical. Keep in mind, this is bipartisan in the Congress. Mr. Warner is a centrist Democrat. And the Democrats feel just the way the Republicans do on these issues of Chinese dominance and human rights and penetration of American society. These are things that they agree. It's one of this city doesn't agree on much, but this is where both sides of the aisle in Congress and senior leaders in the Trump administration, a very controversial administration, and they agree on what toughness toward China is needed across the board, and particularly in the areas that they're concerned about. So that is powerful, but it's not necessarily definitive. It's not going to last if they don't have support in the media and in public opinion. And in 2018, you find the media mainstream media takes a long time to understand this. They don't understand this. They see Trump as mainly a protectionist. That's it. He's just a protectionist. He's a lot more than that. And that's the point I'm trying to get at. And they don't see the danger in China. They come to see it over time, but it takes a while. And then the public opinion, they have no idea what this is about. I went to different places in the United States, over 20 different talks I gave in the United States in 2018 and 2019. And the public had very little idea what I was talking about. Aren't we supposed to like the Chinese, is the way they would say, or isn't engagement good? This kind of response is what I would get when I would try to explain this to them. So this raised doubts whether this policy would be sustainable. Okay, you got this group in Washington that feels this way. Is this really going to spread to the country as a whole? So I was watching this very carefully to see what happened. At this time, in early 2019, public opinion was ambivalent about China. They liked the government of China, but they really weren't hostile to it. They saw Iran and North Korea much more dangerous than China. And then you have the Democrats running for president. You have all these candidates. And so you'd think that if China is a real worry, that this issue would come up in the campaign. Look at the record of these campaign meetings and so forth, and these various debates that the Democrats had. The China issue hardly ever comes up. When I look at I track this kind of stuff, and so when I see candidates, they have YouTube, so the candidates is answering questions. And they'll be doing this for an hour. So you go through the whole thing, and a question on China If it comes up at all, it comes up in minute 53 of 60 minutes. It's not that big a deal. And the candidates show this. And it's not that the Democrats are soft on China. It's just that they don't have that sense of urgency. So what am I talking about? Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden, he thinks, and by the way, just if I could be truthful here, I'm a lifelong Democrat, just to confess this. I'm going to be critical of Democrats here. But Mr. Biden says, he's asked about China. He says, oh, we can handle China. It's no problem. We're much better off than they are. And then Mr. Bloomberg got into the race. And Mr. Bloomberg has economic ties to China that you can't beat. He's defending Xi Jinping in public venues in the United States before he becomes a candidate. So in the campaign, he remains quiet about China. He doesn't talk about it. But then you have Mr. Sanders. And Mr. Sanders is sort of like Donald Trump in a lot of ways in the campaign. He doesn't blame China for taking advantage of the United States. He doesn't like it. But he thinks it's the trade deals. That's the thing that's bad. And so he was asked point blank, Sanders was asked, is China an existential threat to the United States? And he said, I don't think it's an existential threat. And he went on and explained why he felt that way and so forth. And Elizabeth Warren feels the same way. She didn't like the Chinese, doesn't like what they do, but certainly she's not that critical of them. She's critical of the big business and things like that who make deals with China. Mr. Buttigieg, this is the mayor from Indianapolis, Indiana. He did see China as a real danger, but he said we need to cooperate with them. And we should work with our allies and make an agreement of some sort with China. So nothing urgent in his and then Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota, very sensible senator. And so she had a campaign. She stuck to her message all the time. She was an excellent candidate. And she said, and she had 100 tasks that she would do if she were elected president in the first 100 days of her government. 100 of them. And only one of them dealt with China, and it was like number 82. And it had to do with steel dumping in Minnesota. So China just wasn't a big deal for these people in 2019. And then you had a pushback from a lot of China experts, many of my friends, people who had devoted their lives to working with China. And they said, this is the wrong way to go. We shouldn't be harsh on China. We should try to meet China halfway. And so they signed various letters and so forth. They got a bit of publicity and so forth. So that was a moderating trend. And I always looked at 2019. I said, well, maybe this hardening is going to get weaker. In the Congress legislation in 2019, there was a lot of it that was critical of China, but it was very scattered. It didn't have that impact that the bill in 2018 had on the need for an across-the-board hardening in American policy, American government policy toward China. But concurrent with this moderating trend in 2019 were hardening trends. So the Justice Department resumed its tough efforts on China almost immediately after the trade deal was signed. February 2nd. The trade deal was in late January, and this is February 2nd. And very tough on a whole range of issues. Huawei was a big target for them. Industrial espionage, using scientific thefts, using scientific exchanges to do this sort of thing. All of this was quite important. Then Mr. Pompeo, he was outspoken against China. He is the most outspoken senior administration leader on China these days. He speaks out on all sorts of issues. The media was now more aware of the China danger and tended to be more supportive of it, of a tougher policy toward China. And then you had all these studies done by various think tanks, progressive think tanks, conservative think tanks, that documented all the bad things that China had done to the United States through the engagement policy. In other words, when you ostensibly had one set of intentions, overt intentions, but in fact, they had a whole set of things that they were doing that would undermine the United States. And I've examined these types of things and used it in my work and so forth. And I saw it myself in how the Chinese, I did a long investigation of China-Russia relations. And I watched how the Chinese worked with the Russians time and time again. They had different interests, they cooperated together, they had different approaches, but at the end of the day, the thing they had in common, that their common interest would be they would undermine American power and influence. And that's what you see. And I can go through this if you want, but it's now clearer. There's lots of evidence you can use to support this. And then elements of Mr. Trump's base. This is important to keep in mind. Politically, he's a very political president. He's worried about re-election. Most politicians are in Washington. And his base is full of people that don't like China. Number one are the workers who think they lost their jobs because of China. You know, a lot of them. The entrepreneurs, the business people who feel they have lost their business because of China. And there are a lot of them. And then there's those Americans that don't like foreigners. And there are a lot of them too. And they don't like China. And then there are the evangelical Christians. This is a little hard, it's a stretch for me. But here, the evangelical Christians, they support Mr. Trump's hardness toward China. They don't like China. Religious freedom is a big issue for them. China's abortion policies and so forth of the past were an abomination for these people. And so those four constituencies really don't like China. And they work together with various conservative groups politically to form a coalition that gives a high salience to the China issue. Okay, so now we're into this year, 2020, and we have an opportunity for cooperation. It's made to order for cooperation, leadership, the two powers is supposed to lead and so forth. Well, Mr. Trump is very erratic in his approach. And initially, for 2 months, he's positive toward China. Xi Jinping's doing a good job. He's assured me about everything. And then he becomes very critical. The criticism starts in early March, at the end of the first week in March. And the Chinese at this time had been coming out with their propaganda offensive on COVID-19, where they said they were really effective in containing it in China, and they're really generous in giving provisions to various countries throughout the world. And the Americans were floundering at this time, trying to figure out what to do. Like many other countries were like this. And so Mr. Trump's people, I assume, saw this as an information operation, and they wanted to undermine it. And what they focused on, of course, is that this virus came from China. And so they called it the China virus, or the Wuhan virus, naming for the city in China where it came from. And but this became a more salient issue as the Republican Party saw this as a way of getting attention away from Trump's poor handling of the early stages of the epidemic in the United States and focusing on China as the cause. And so they're doing that. That has grown in importance, and likely this is going to continue into the platform and into the election campaign. And so and they started attacking Biden on this issue. His record with Obama and so forth, he was soft on China. And Mr. Biden returned the charges. He attacked back. And it's significant. If you're a China person, this is quite significant because he's not saying that China is nice or he's being as hard on China as he's ever been. But he's saying, Mr. Trump, you're the one that's soft on China, not me. You're the one that wants the trade deal, and therefore you're being soft on China, on the virus, not me. So you can see now that the Democratic candidates, Mr. Biden, has changed. He's taking a tougher position on China. And again, for partisan reasons, for political reasons, yes, I think the incentive is there because the Republicans are making this a very important aspect. And so the attacks on China from the administration, from Congress continue. That mainly China is responsible for the virus and the plague. Reparations are being talked about. This lab in Wuhan is getting a lot of attention as the source of this, the idea that they had an accident. The cables and information you have is that the Chinese were seen as very loose and how they carried out these experiments. There's a history of this. And so, and they were doing these very dangerous things of boosting the lethality of various viruses like this. So this raises that question in the minds of even sensible people. This isn't a crazy theme. This is something that will be investigated, and I'm not sure what's going to come of it. Is it like you know, the Iraqis having nuclear weapons? Is that kind of issue? The intelligence community is very sensitive on this, as you can well imagine. So they're not going to be buffaloed into coming into this conclusion. But at the same time, the circumstantial evidence is pretty powerful. And as more look at it, you can't dismiss it. Is the basic point. So this will be investigated by the administration and by the Congress. And then you have this whole idea of China's generosity. And what's seen in the Congress is that the Chinese, at the beginning of the virus, they nationalized all their production. So all these factories producing these kinds of PPE materials to go overseas couldn't send them overseas. They stayed in China. And they went out and bought a whole bunch of other stuff on the international market, basically not leaving much left when somebody else comes along and wants to get these kinds of materials, like the United States. Now, Congress is investigating this, and they say this is profiteering. This is using this kind of control of these commodities for international leverage. And they are doling it out to all the countries that say nice things to them. And so it looks very cynical from the congressional point of view, even though from the Chinese point of view, it looks very generous. You know, here we are, we're doing all these wonderful things. So that's going to be investigated. And following this is those that are following this, they see the Chinese industries have been geared up. Many of them have continued producing things. Steel has continued to be produced to beat the band in China, even though the market is totally glutted. And who's going to buy it? Where's it going to go? At the end of the economic crisis in 2008, the Chinese took advantage of this type of situation to gain greater market share. They undercut the opposition, and they got greater market share by exporting their surplus to these other places. And the speculation is they'll do the same now. So that's under investigation. So you have, as these things come out, and if they're proven, it's going to be more negative publicity for China. And meanwhile, China, of course, is giving tit for tat. They're harsh responses. So the kind of, and now apparently they're working with Russia to interfere in the American election. And this is something they didn't do before. They would go in for cyber theft reasons to get intellectual property, but to interfere with the elections, we hadn't seen much of this. Reportedly, this is what they're doing now. And given the ever closer relationship they have with Putin's Russia, it's plausible that they're doing this kind of thing. And so, and these kind of planting these untrue stories about making the U.S. military look like they're responsible for the COVID-19 because they planted it in Wuhan and in a previous military visit there. This kind of speculation by senior officials in China goes down very badly in the United States. Okay, so the short-term outlook, obviously you see the picture. Keep in mind, this is a situation report. This is not something that you can say, this is the way it is. I don't think you can do that. We're in a situation where we can tell you, I can tell you my take on it, give you my pieces and how they fit together as far as I'm concerned. And I think looking at it from the Washington perspective, I can add to your knowledge, I think, because I'm not sure you're in a position to get this kind of assessment. And I wanted to share it with you. But is this the whole story? Not by any means. This is a situation report. And, but I think it's important to have it these days because you need to have your facts straight as much as you possibly can. So I'm trying to do that. And what I see is the hardening is going to continue on both sides this year. I think that's pretty clear. We're into the election mode. This is now a campaign issue, much more serious than any time China's been a campaign issue since after Tiananmen, it was a big campaign issue. George H.W. Bush in 1992 in Clinton Clinton made this China a big issue. Coddling dictators. He criticized George H.W. Bush when he talked about Tiananmen in China. So I think we're going to see a lot of this. Although my sense is that you're going to see both the Republicans and Democrats showing that they're the tough guys in dealing with China. It's not going to be somebody, oh, we need to take a moderate approach. The people that want to take a moderate approach, the people that signed the letter that I talked about in 2019, what about them? Well, a lot of them worked with previous governments, and that their previous government's policies toward China are now seen as flawed. Mr. Pompeo puts it graphically. He said, you were asleep at the switch. The Chinese changed and you just kept the same plan and they took a total advantage of you. That's Pompeo's argument. And that sticks. And it makes what these people say today look less credible. They blew it in 2008, they blew it in 2002, and now we're supposed to listen to them now. And so they're not getting much of a hearing as far as I can see in the current situation. And so this bipartisan opposition in the Congress continues, and the likelihood of more negative things coming out about China on the source of the virus, the lab, and so forth. And the mainstream media and public opinion see China very negatively. After the virus controversy took place, public opinion polls in the United States saw a 20% decline in their disapproval of China, in their 20% decline in their approval of China. In other words, very few people approve of China, and big increase in the number of people that disapprove of the Chinese government. This is I've never seen anything like this since Tiananmen. Tiananmen was this similar type of reaction. So public opinion is not in the mood to think that China is credible or nice in any way. Whether they want big trouble with China is another matter. Donald Trump, he's unpredictable, as we know. He may want to make a deal with China. I think for this year, it's too hard to do. Too many forces and political reasons not to do it. Joseph Biden, I think he has this tendency to want to engage with China, as he did in the Obama years. He may want to go back to that. But I don't think he can do that, given the atmosphere in Washington and the country at this time. And so the idea of meeting China halfway and so forth, I think is very difficult to do. So longer term, there are big questions that haven't been answered. And just a couple of them. Number one, cost. This kind of pushback against China, meeting China's challenges, is very costly. Is the United States government in any condition to do these kinds of costs? Are the American people willing to pay for these kinds of costs? This is competition in the high-tech industries, this is military defense, this is surveillance inside the United States, all sorts of areas where more expense will be needed. We haven't addressed this issue, and I'm not sure we can do it in the United States. Will the COVID-19 become so pervasive? In other words, will it come back and remain preoccupying us for 2 years? And will that overshadow this China debate? That could happen. That could happen because we keep getting depressed about how long we're going to be in the sheltering at home in this kind of a situation. And does the United States have strategies to deal with China that are plausible, that can actually do it? So these three big questions in the future are for the future. But I think the situation is such, as I tried to explain it to you, that we are really on a road of hardening toward China. And the Chinese are just giving it back right every step of the way now. And so I just don't see how we can ease that for the rest of this year. We have to wait till the results of the presidential election and maybe, or something else that would overwhelm us. But we're in the midst of the virus when we should be cooperating and we're not. So that suggests that the virus hasn't made us cooperate and ease this tension. So this tension between the United States and China seems to have a lot of importance to it, a lot of substance. Okay, so that's a long explanation. Thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sutter, for this excellent and stimulating talk. We are now opening a Q&A period. To better organize ourselves, I please ask those who want to make a comment or question to do so using the little hand or the chat that you may find on the Zoom bar below, so that I can pass the word. And as we have many participants to intervene and make comments, and as we want to give time enough to our distinguished guests to respond, we all appreciate if you put your questions in a very direct and concise manner. Okay, so thank you. Let me see the first hands. I have a question here on the chat from Sergio Nunes. He's asking about the US reaction on the events in Hong Kong. Should US use more sanctions, such used against Russia and Crimea, or take hawkish policies or dovish policies?
Mm-hmm. I think the only publicity, thank you for the question, it's a very good one. The only publicity we're seeing on this is the negative. So how much do we punish China? In the Congress, this is a big issue. All the Democratic candidates said negative things about China's practice in Hong Kong. It was a big issue for them, at least rhetorically. When you get down to what you can actually do, you see that it's quite limited. And so sanctions are an option, and that could be where we wind up, what winds up. Mr. Trump, I'm sure you're familiar with this. He, in the campaign of 2016, put it this way. He said, "You'll be amazed at how pragmatic I can be about human rights." In other words, he didn't care about human rights. And so this kind of an issue is not a big thing for him. But Mr. Pompeo, being very critical of China on a whole range of issues, has been very critical of them on Hong Kong as well. So I would think lots of rhetoric, you'll see lots of rhetoric, and maybe some substantive sanctions. But after that, what do you do? And invade or, no, I don't think you can do very much. And I think that's well accepted. And so it's very unfortunate for the people in Hong Kong that have been protesting, because the U.S. doesn't have many options that it can take in order to deal with this situation, other than symbolic ones, heavily symbolic ones.
Okay, now we have Yolanda Pinto, then Natasha.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. I have a couple of questions for you. In your opinion, will the industrial capacity of China, combined with the resources of raw materials, energy of Russia, lead to an Euro-Asiatic economic integration? Another question, can the enlargement of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization create an area of Sino-Russian influence capable to draw the traditional US allies like Japan and Australia towards it? And finally, will China profit from the fall of the oil prices, and how will the USA deal with this? And naturally, how will the USA will also deal with what we now call de-dollarization?
Okay, Bob, if you agree, maybe we could collect two more questions. Natasha, please.
Thank you.
Forward. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, so mine is not a question per se, but on the third point, you talked about sharp attacks on the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like for you, if you could elaborate a little bit on this matter, a little bit more, if that was possible.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, António Temporão.
Good evening, Professor Robert. I would like to listen to you about the new digital coin of the government Chinese just announced. How do you think this is going to affect the economic relation between US and the Asia area, please? Thank you.
Okay.
Bob, I think you should answer that now.
Okay, the Russian-China economic integration. This is, they are more integrated. This is something that I'm not sure how deeply the Russians want to get integrated with China. One of the things, when you study Russia-China relations, as I have done deeply, I was in charge of a big study group, over 110 specialists. We worked at this for 2.5 years. This is the National Bureau of Asian Research. You can look at their website. They have lots of good stuff on Russia-China relations. And this is an issue that really didn't come up much. I think the Russians are a bit wary of this sort of thing. Russia its economy is 1/10 the size of China's. And so the Russians do want to sell things to China, but generally they're selling raw materials and energy, and they're doing that in a very big way these days, as well as arms. And so the integration in Central Asia, for example, they are trying to coordinate the union that the Russians support, and the Chinese have their Belt and Road Initiative. And the Russians, Mr. Putin was ambivalent or a little bit wary of it at first, but he's come around and he's cooperative with China. This is the pattern that we've generally seen. That is, Putin needs China, and China doesn't need Putin as much. Both of them are willing to work with each other, and they both help each other. But in Asia, Putin doesn't allow his desires to do things to get in the way of offending China. So on Central Asia, on Korea, on Japan, on the South China Sea, he defers to China in a considerable way. Not always in Central Asia, but in these other areas he does. And so this kind of integration, if China really pushed it, then sure, they might take place. But why would China push it? Why would China want this? Russia is not a particular, China doesn't invest in Russia. It's not a good place to invest. And so they work with Russia on energy and other issues, but they don't do this kind of thing. So I think this economic integration is something that's sort of I'm not sure how big a deal it is. On the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's expanding and so forth. And this what you say conceivably could happen. But at this point, the SCO has postured itself as being hostile to Japan, as being, and very difficult for Australia to join because they favor a approach that's always against US alliances. They don't like US alliances. So I think this would be a problem for these countries. They'd have to change a lot. SCO would have to change a lot. I don't see them moving in that direction. They don't seem to be doing that kind of thing. China and the oil prices, obviously they benefit from the decline in oil prices. They're the biggest importer of oil by any means. The de-dollarization, that's something I haven't investigated. I don't know the trend there and how the idea that it would be, that the dollar would be much less important in the oil trade, I think is what you're driving at, but I don't, and they would like that. The Chinese would like that. What they're prepared to do about it is, I'm not sure. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for that one. On the attacks on the BRI, this is something that's really hard to understand in a lot of ways unless you investigate it more. The biggest person that speaks about this is the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo. He talks about this all the time. And it looks so unfair because China is offering these things to these various countries that need the infrastructure and so forth. And so this is all seems good. You know, it's a good thing, right? And I've just finished, I have these books that I write, and I'm just finishing a new edition of one on Chinese foreign relations. And so I just finished it, and if you look at the BRI, and it has all, when you get a BRI, you have that relationship with China, you get a lot of stuff with it. You don't just get the BRI. And what happens is that the Chinese have beefed up, and this is evident in Europe in particular. They've beefed up their embassy staff. They're much better funded. They have many more agents of influence, party channels, various front organizations, as well as the regular diplomats, student organizations, and so forth. And they penetrate the society in various ways. And they influence it that way. They want these people to welcome the Belt and Road Initiative. And so it's effective in various places, particularly if a place doesn't have good internal governance, if they're not having good internal security people. This is easy to do, and they do it. And that comes along with BRI. So what you find is that who makes the BRI deals and how are they made? They're non-transparent. And study after study has shown a very common feature of BRI deals, not all, but many, is corruption. And the people on the receiving end like to be corrupted, and the Chinese, I guess, don't mind it either. Because in the end, the loan is being paid back by the receiving country. And so you find this, and I've just a couple of examples. Montevideo, right? What's the name of Moldavia. Moldova? There's a country on the Black Sea. You got to help me.
Moldova.
Moldova, thank you.
Moldova.
Yeah, and Moldova is an excellent example of this. This guy runs a syndicate. You know, he's the president. He runs a syndicate. They have deals with the Chinese. He gets along fine with them. You got 600,000 people in this place, and this is how it works. And the Chinese are more than happy to do this sort of thing, and they do this all over the world. It's not that I don't want to accuse everybody of being corrupt, but a lot of these deals are corrupt. I am more familiar with Asia, and the examples are the Philippines, Arroyo. Not Duterte, but Duterte I suspect, but Arroyo definitely. Malaysia, Myanmar, Cambodia. It's all corrupt. It's everywhere in Southeast Asia. And so these are all BRI deals. So that's just one thing. So if you like corrupt deals, if you like authoritarian governments, because they tend to support authoritarian governments, then this is great. And the Chinese win a lot of points that way. These authoritarian governments, it works really well with them. BRI in the Middle East is very popular. Got a lot of authoritarians, they like this stuff. But if you're in a Western country and you think we can do better, have sustainable growth, we can have accountable governance, we like rule of law, this kind of thing, then this is undermining all of that. To what end? Why are we undermining this? Because it makes it easier for the Chinese to carry out their transactions, to have influence in these places. Is that in American interest? I think not. So we have to think about these kind of things in looking at those aspects. Other things that come with the BRI have to do things like Huawei, the control of ICT, this control of these entities. A lot has been made of how Chinese can spy using Huawei communications. Not enough has been devoted to the fact that if you have these, if the Chinese get you to buy these communications and you put them in, are you going to move away from China? That's a big expense. That's a big stake you have and they're in your country. Does this give the Chinese influence over the longer haul? Yes. Are the Chinese prepared to use this influence? I think in Europe, you've seen this so-called tantrum diplomacy on the part of Chinese diplomats. They use this all the time. We have a tantrum president. I have to be fair. He can use it all the time too. But the point is they do it. And so is that something you really want to see happen? So there's a lot of this. I can go into other details. I'm sorry to bore you. It tends to be in the details. It tends to be in the operations of the Chinese to control different sensitive aspects of a society once they move in with the BRI. BRI is the entry point. They have big operations, and they get control over various aspects: surveillance, communications, media, all of these types of things. You know, I was amazed in Italy. Did you know, is this true? That there's a major Italian news agency, and they partner with Xinhua, and Xinhua's items go across their wire, and it's I forget what the name of the agency is. It's an Italian news agents, like Associated Press in the United States. That's what they do. And so this all comes with BRI, folks. And so I think this is what I'm getting at. So that's, I'm sorry to go on like that. On the digital coin, obviously the Chinese don't like the US dollar being dominant. Maybe the digital coin will be something that will move in this direction. But they have their own currency. It would be more of a challenge to the United States and the dollar if they would let it have free exchange, but they won't. They want to control their economy. They need to for their own reasons. And so that makes it really hard for them to be, so I'm not sure this coin will do much better than the Chinese yuan, but I don't know. I'm done enough about this. Thanks, good questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I have some more questions coming from the chat. For instance, Ricardo is asking if you think, Bob, that an alternative to the One Belt, One Road would be the answer for the US economic prevalence. And Maria Luisa would like your opinion on the geopolitical implication of Chinese presence in Latin America, considering the proximity of the US. Carlos Martins is asking the implications of US faces China in relation with Brazil. It's kind of the same question as Latin America. Miguel Braz is saying that even if China is making such great improvements economically and in high tech, the American military is much more powerful. It's the only military with true global reach, the US military. There are some that think that China is a very fragile country that seems big to the outside, and is quoting George Friedman, for example. So he's asking, what do you think on this opinion? And if you allow me, I give the floor to Francisco Megre that is saying, as a question, please, Francisco.
Thank you, Luis. Hi, Professor Sutter. Pleasure to hear you. Just, I'm concerned that China can go through a process like Japan in the 90s, where a lot of the workforce goes into retirement. But the main concern is that they don't have a safety net. And the legitimacy of the Communist Party is that people have work, and that's why they keep subsidizing the economy. What do you think can happen in the next 10 years regarding that?
And another one from Enrique, please, a short one. Enrique Cruz.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I'd like to ask what is Europe in the China and the West relations, Professor?
And finally, I have one question also from the chat. She or he, I don't know, Asdoval, is asking about the US versus China in Africa. Okay, Bob, I think it's the final round of questions. The floor is yours again.
Thanks for the questions. They were very good. The alternative to the BRI, that's a very good question. The US is trying to do something about that in Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific area. They're working with Australia and with Japan to compete in building infrastructure in Asia. This is a pretty expensive sort of thing, and BRI is involved in a lot of places that are not credit risks, not good credit risks. And China has a way of getting paid back that is a lot more flexible than most creditors in the West would think is good. So the alternative to the BRI is the World Bank, right? And these regional banks and the Asian Development Bank in Asia, of course. But that's not really, they're not doing that. They're not doing infrastructure in this. So the US has this build program, which this used to be called OPIC in the United States, the government agency that fosters these kinds of deals and facilitates it. But it requires that the enterprise, the construction company and so forth, be willing to go in and do the arrangements themselves and get paid back that way. So this kind of money that China can put into these kinds of things, the loans that they can do in this regard, are hard to beat from the American point of view. I think it's the Japanese do a lot of this, and Australians help, and I think probably Europeans would get involved in this to some degree. And so maybe that should be done. It maybe should be done. I'm cautious because, number one, if you look at the BRI, it's pretty similar in scope to the going out policy of the previous decade. And the going out policy of the previous decade, what did it amount to? It amounted to China establishing itself as an important player economically in various parts of the world. Who did they dominate? Well, not too many. Their investment was in Africa, 5% of their investment in Latin America, 5%. This is around 2015. In Middle East, probably a little less. The big thing was the lending. The lending was they were the biggest lender in many of these places. How sustainable is that? As far as these countries, can they pay it back anymore? And more importantly, I think what you find is fundamental weaknesses in all of these arrangements that the Chinese have. Number one, there's so many things that they agree to that don't happen. And so the scope of the BRI and the impact of it looks much larger in the publicity, and the Chinese play up this publicity, and most Western media play it up too, and it's false. It's not true. They don't do it. They do part of it, but they don't do it. So you have a whole series of big deals that they don't do. Then you have big deals that they do. Those are important. And you have big deals they do, but then they run across lots of difficulties in doing them. And so it takes many years to do these. I mean, 10 years, 15 years to get some of these things done. And then and some of them don't work. They don't work well. So there's a big dam in Ecuador that was a big hydroelectric dam, and $1.5 billion in this thing. And it doesn't work. And they're not economically viable. And then you have smaller deals that go through. And so I think you just have to look at this carefully. But a lot of them don't work, a lot of them do work, and a lot of them don't get done. And so at the end of the day, I'm not sure what the effect of the BRI is going to be. Because obviously the BRI is on hard times right now. The Chinese can't lay out a lot of money now. If you look at how they're dealing with the virus, normally you would see a big stimulus effort in China. They're not doing that. They don't have the money to do it. You know, they're debt conscious right now. They have to be careful of their own debt. And so this is so is BRI going to suffer as a result? I think so. I think it's going to suffer a lot. So we'll have a lot of publicity, everything's normal and so forth, but I think the idea of actually doing more is something that's going to be hard. And so I guess I would say Americans should calm down about the BRI a little bit. And we found the going out strategy, they made a big deal out of that, and they became a player in Africa, a player in Latin America, and they were important. Brazil, they're very important. Latin America, second largest trader. But look at the financing, example, in Latin America. Look at the financing in Latin America this past year. It's almost nothing from the state banks. You know, 10 years ago, they were giving, 15 billion a year. Now it's 1 billion. And trade used to be the big attraction for China. Remember that? Growth of trade, they're a big engine of growth. Trade in China has been flat. 2015 trade, no growth. 2016 trade, no growth. Picked up in 17, picked up in 18. You think it's going to pick up in 19 and 20? No way. It's going way down. So what's going to be the impetus? Well, it's going to be this investment. These loans are going to be it. But how far can you take that? So I just think that in the broader scope of things, I'm not too worried about BRI. BRI basically means Chinese economic interaction with most of the world. It covers just about everything the Chinese do economically with all these different countries. And it does lead to projects, but I'm not sure how I just don't know how overall the impact of what it will be. Publicity-wise, it has a big impact. Public opinion has a big impact. But over time, I think it might not have such a big impact. So just watch that. On China's strategy in Latin America and Brazil, the way I would characterize Chinese strategy in Latin America, in Africa, and the Middle East. The Middle East is more important now because it's in the BRI. It's right at the center of it. So this gives them more importance. And China is steadily doing a lot more in the Middle East than they did before. They didn't do a lot in the Middle East, but they're doing a lot more now, economically. And then, you know, as far as politics and security matters, they're very careful not to take sides in the Middle East. So they don't take big positions that are very forceful in the Middle East issues. They're very careful to avoid alienating anybody in the Middle East. In Africa, they're really not, they're sustaining a relationship. Let me just put it in perspective. In 2015, the Chinese media was talking about the growth, the anticipated trade that year of $300 billion, and saying that the target should be $400 billion by 2020. In 2019, if I have my facts straight, it was $185 billion in trade. So Africa is sort of, they're doing their thing. They have their commitments, but it's sort of on the edge of the Belt and Road. And I just don't see it as a big, high priority for the Chinese. They had this big meeting in 2018 with all the African countries. They meet every 3 years. And the Chinese made a lot of promises. And every year, every time they would meet, every 3 years, they would double or triple what they did before. This time, they did the same as they did before. They're not increasing their commitment in Africa. In Latin America, what you find is that the trade is more vigorous than it is in Africa. Trade is about, it's the same as the Middle East, about closer to 300 billion rather than 200 billion. And the Chinese activities there are varied. I'm trying to think what's the, oh yeah, the main change that I mentioned is the change in the development banks. Export-Import Bank and China Development Bank. Very little increase in this year, in 2019, very little done. About $1 billion, $1.5 billion of loans. And here you have some big, big problems for China. Venezuela is a very big problem for China in Latin America. I mean, that's you know, the Chinese have this very close relationship. They probably could get closer, but they don't want to get closer because it's sucking out money and not bringing money in. And so it's a big problem for them. And Ecuador is one of these corrupt regimes that made these deals, and now they're debt dependent to beat the band, and so it's a headache as well as a source of leverage perhaps, but it's a real headache for the Chinese as well. So I don't see big breakthroughs in Latin America. I'm not a Latin American specialist. I think the main concern from Latin American specialists who are Americans is that China is taking advantage of the lack of attention to Latin America on the part of the US government. And so they're filling a vacuum in that sense. And I guess it's pretty easy for them to do so because the vacuum, I guess, is pretty big. The US isn't much a government that's favorable to the countries of Latin America. So that makes the Chinese, I guess, more important, relatively speaking. But their involvement in all of those places, I think, in not all of those places, in Africa and in Latin America, I sense it's just not a priority as it was, say, in the first decade of the 21st century, when they really wanted a lot of these resources and they needed them. They don't need them now as much. And so I think that's a big change. Let's see, so I talked about Africa. On Europe and U.S.-China relations. I find this fascinating. I'm not sure you're paying much attention to this, but really Europe has emerged as sort of a hotbed of outward tension and competition for influence between the United States and China. And the Chinese ambassadors in Sweden, gosh, isn't he a character? I mean, he's just an amazing guy. He's the guy that said, you know, we know how to deal with our enemies. We just use shotguns against our enemies. It's great, just a great diplomat. And so these kinds of competitions are very strong now. And what I see is that over time, what does China want in Europe? And what they want is a pliant Europe. They want to be able to expand their influence there. They want to be able to have these economic exchanges and be in a position where they can control the situation as they need to control it. And what's in the way? Well, the US, NATO is in the way to some degree, but what's really in the way is the European Union. And what do? Well, they undermine it. They undermine the European Union. And they do this by peeling off various countries, Greece and Italy if they can, and the Central and Eastern European countries, they have their own special organization that's separate from Europe, the European Union. And the standards for them are much different than the standards that the European Union requires. And because the Chinese don't like those standards, that gets in the way of their influence operations. They like to deal with corrupt governments in that sense. And you see what I mean? It's non-transparent deals. BRI comes with that. And if you stand for transparency, if you stand for rules and laws and this type of thing, you're in the way. And they want that to get out of the way. And so the bottom line is they weaken the EU. And as they have weakened ASEAN, watch what they did to ASEAN. It's tragic, but they just undermined it. And ASEAN now is not capable of taking a position critical of China now. It's just sad, you know, but and that's, I'm not sure they want to go that far with Europe, but they clearly want them to be weaker and the Union to be weaker. And that makes them, these other places, more open to their influence. So it's it's an understandable approach, but I think that's what they're, and right now they're getting a lot of blowback. And it's amazing. And I don't know who I'm an old intelligence officer, and what I found, just reading the media, I haven't really found too much evidence of this, is that intelligence officers seem very concerned about China as a danger to their countries. You see this in Europe, in the Nordic countries, you see this in Germany, you see it in Poland, you see it in a whole bunch of places, that they are the ones who, in England, they're the ones that see the danger from China. Whereas the political people who are very influenced by trade and benefits of this kind of deals and the money they're going to make, tend to put those things aside. And what's happened, I think, is that those national security concerns have become increasingly important. And as these countries realize what's at stake, and what's at stake is what these people in the United States think is at stake: dominance. Do you want to be dominated? I mean, do you want to be, is everything going to be okay if you're in that kind of an order? And I think that, you know, the values and standards that you have and that you've worked to defend and so forth as a Western country are fairly powerful and important. And the Chinese don't want those. They want to weaken those. They're against China's interest. And so this is a big problem. And so you come to see, if you connect the dots, you see the Chinese as a systemic threat. It's a systemic threat. It's a danger to the system. And so if you like the system, you want to sustain it, you might want to think twice about it, about the Belt and Road and other types of things. Let's see, the aging population, yep, that's a big problem. It's just going to get worse. And I think this is something they don't have a good answer for, and they know it, and it makes them cautious. And these kinds of internal problems make the Chinese cautious in dealing with the United States. You have to ask yourself, Donald Trump's administration is really obnoxious to China. They do really obnoxious things. Why doesn't the Chinese government confront Donald Trump? They don't do it. So if they have an issue with Huawei and the Canadians, the US gets the Canadians to arrest a Huawei official, who do they punish? Canada. Do they punish the United States? No. Why? And some of the reasons have to do with these kinds of issues, these internal problems. I wouldn't say China's fragile. I don't think it's fragile. I think it's a tight authoritarian state. But they do have lots of internal preoccupations. And that makes them cautious. They don't want to get into a confrontation with the United States. They really didn't want that trade war. And they thought they could make a deal with Trump. And obviously it's not working. And so this is not desirable. I think they made a mistake. I think they went too far. And so all of these things that have come out, these negatives of what the Chinese are doing, have just reinforced this negative attitude in the United States toward China. And they shouldn't be doing this stuff. They shouldn't be so assertive. They should be, but they obviously felt they should be. And so therefore we have tension. We have this tension. And so this is a feature that I'd like to, that's important. So the idea of China being fragile and the U.S. military being very powerful, that's all true, I think. It's not, I don't think China's real fragile, as I said, but they do have internal preoccupations. But the point is this, I think, as an intelligence officer, when I was a national intelligence officer, the main thing I did was look at, would the Chinese attack Taiwan? That was the main issue. This is 20 years ago, but this is what I had to do. And I was the guy that was in charge of this. I had to tell them yes, no, or whatever. And so you would measure, you would look at the forces, you would see what they had. You'd say, okay, what can they do? And what can these forces do? And you knew pretty much what they could do. And so therefore you could make a judgment. Okay, they have more of these than we do, but we have more of those, and therefore we'll be fine. We deter them by doing, we don't have to have the same, exactly the same weapon system. We can do different things. So that's pretty easy compared to what you're dealing with now. What you're dealing with now is that China will dominate basically through the back door. They will dominate the military because they will control the high technology. If they control the high technology, then they will control the high technology that the military depends on. If they have the more advanced technology and we don't, they're going to be superior. And so, yeah, you can have all these military things that look great, but at the end of the day, if they have better technology, these things will be obsolete. So it sounds, so therefore we're in this sort of technology race. This technology race is something that you can't measure very well. I don't understand it, and I think most people don't understand it. And I talk to experts, and he says, no, you can't understand it because we haven't invented this stuff yet. And so the upshot is you don't want to be dominated in that kind of field. How do you prevent that? You have to be in a position where you dominate. The Chinese don't want to be dominated by the United States in this way. That's what Xi Jinping is working on. China 2025 is designed to make sure that China is not dominated by this sort of system. The Snowden disclosures in 2013, these things were a real eye-opener to the Chinese. They said, wow, look what they can do. So the result is they just doubled down to make sure that wouldn't happen to them. And the only way you're going to be secure is if you feel you really dominate. So I think we're in that kind of a race with China. Who's going to dominate these high technology industries? And what forces go in to make one side or the other more powerful? I think we're going to have to just get ready for that. And I think we're in the middle of it now. It's underway. And so that's more, in a way, it's more important than the balance of forces in the Asia Pacific region, how many aircraft carriers. That's very important for the here and now. But when you're looking down the road, then you have to think of a new way of warfare. The Americans call this the third offset. This is just the whole, we had maybe some of you in the military remember the revolution in military affairs maybe 20 years ago. Well, that's the new thing that's coming. this new technology will result in a very different force structure and a very different weapons array. And so we're in the middle of that now. Okay, I think I covered the questions. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, Professor Sutter, once again, I please ask all the participants to give an applause using the little reactions that you have below on the bar. And Bob, it was a great pleasure, an amazing session. Thank you for sharing with us some of your knowledge. And I think it's a great benefit to all of us and very stimulating the way you put it, this tension and competition between the US and China. So thank you. Have the rest of a good afternoon there in Washington, DC. And for all participants, thank you also for your nice and great questions. And I hope to see you next week for another conference. Bob, thank you. A todos, boa noite. Fiquem bem, Bob. I don't know if you want to say something.
No, I just appreciate the opportunity. It's you're all under house, imprisoned in your house, as am I. I just finished teaching this semester. Our semester ends last week, and so I have 110 papers to grade. So this is a real blessing to just take a break from those papers and to give a substantive talk like this and get so many challenging and good questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. And good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Boa noite a todos.
Boa noite a todos.
Boa noite.
Boa noite a todos.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.